Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that feels oddly familiar, yet completely alien. It's one of those little quirks of history that doesn't get talked about much outside of niche books, but once you hear it, you'll never look at your sleep schedule the same way again. So, dim the lights, maybe let that cup of tea cool on the nightstand, and get comfortable. Because tonight's journey is about sleep itself. Or rather, how medieval Europeans slept in a way that might sound weird, but actually makes a lot of sense. They called it first sleep and second sleep. That's right, people in the Middle Ages didn't just pass out for 8 hours straight like we're told to now. No, their nights were broken into two neat little chunks, with a sort of midnight intermission in between. Think of it as binge watching a show, except the episodes are unconsciousness. And instead of scrolling on your phone in the dark, you'd be poking at the fire, saying a few prayers, maybe sneaking in some gossip, or, if you were feeling bold, wandering outside. Let's float gently into this medieval night and see why people thought splitting up their sleep was the natural way to go. Natural sleep without electricity. The first thing to know is that this two-sleep pattern wasn't some weird European invention. It was actually the natural human response to a world without electric light. When the sun went down around, say, 6 or 7 p.m. in the winter, the medieval household didn't exactly throw on a Netflix marathon. Candles were expensive. Firewood was precious. So for most people, darkness meant winding down. Imagine finishing your bread and pottage, because yes, that was dinner, again, and then just nothing. The day's work was done. The animals were quiet, and so people drifted off to bed a couple hours after sundown. That might mean you're tucked in by 8 or 9 p.m. But here's the catch. Our bodies don't actually love doing one long stretch of sleep if the nights are 12 or 14 hours long, like they are in a European winter. So people would naturally wake up, usually around midnight. They'd stir, yawn, and climb out of bed for what was casually called the watch. And here's where the term comes in. The hours before midnight were first sleep. After this midnight limbo, you drift back for your second sleep. 2 acts, 1 night. So, what exactly did people do during this mysterious middle of the night? Spoiler, it wasn't wild raves or feasts. This was the Middle Ages, remember. If you were lucky, you might get to poke around with a candle. If not, you relied on the fire's embers and your own sense of touch. The activities were surprisingly practical. People prayed. Religious manuals actually had special prayers written specifically for this midnight waking. It was seen as a holy time, very pious vibes. Others used the time for, let's say, marital relations. And honestly, it made sense. Doctors in the early modern period even recommended it. They thought the body was rested from first sleep, digestion was underway, and the spirit was calmer. A medieval sex ed pamphlet would probably have read, "Wait until midnight, trust us." For the less romantically inclined, midnight was also a good time for small chores, fixing tools, mending clothes, maybe sneaking a snack. And yes, there are records of people actually visiting neighbors, which is hilarious to imagine. Just picture yourself stumbling across a muddy medieval yard in the dark because you're bored at 1 a.m. and want to chat about crops. Evidence in literature and diaries. Now, you might be wondering, how do we even know this was a thing? Well, historians love when literature accidentally gives away details like this. The phrase first sleep pops up all over medieval and Renaissance writings. It was so common that nobody thought to explain it. It was just assumed the reader would know. For example, in Geoffrey Chaucer's time, people referred casually to after the first sleep, the way we might say after work. In French medical texts, doctors gave advice about what to do between sleeps. Even legal documents sometimes used after the first sleep as a timestamp. Imagine being sued and the court record saying the incident happened between the sleeps. Diaries from the 17th century also help us. A British guy named Roger Eckrich, who basically pioneered the whole study of segmented sleep, dug through tons of old records. He found everything from farmers describing their first sleep to aristocrats making plans for midnight reading. Basically, everybody did it. The science of segmented sleep. Here's the ironic part. Modern sleep scientists say this pattern might actually be more natural than what we do now. Without artificial light, human bodies tend to adopt a biphasic rhythm. That means 2 phases. You sleep for 4 hours, wake up for 1 or 2, then sleep for another 4 hours. When researchers put people in rooms with no clocks and no electric light, guess what happened? After a few weeks, they stopped sleeping in one block and switched back to first and second sleep. It just kind of happened, as if buried deep in our DNA, waiting to come out whenever Wi-Fi goes down. So yeah, if you've ever woken up at 2 a.m. and thought, why can't I sleep like a normal person? Congratulations. You're basically medieval. Who slept like this? Pretty much everyone, but of course, there were differences depending on social class. Peasants had longer nights in winter, so the pattern was more obvious for them. Richer folks had access to more candles, so they might stay up later into the evening before first sleep. But even among the nobility, the idea of 2 sleeps was normal. Imagine a castle bedroom, the lord and lady tucked in with their household, because yes, servants and family often shared space. After a few hours, half the room wakes up. Someone pokes the fire, someone else mutters a prayer, a guard checks the courtyard, and then everyone, like synchronized swimmers, drifts back for second sleep. Even monks followed it. Monastic schedules included middle-of-the-night prayer sessions called matins. The monks would sleep, get up from matins around midnight, chant in the dark, and then return for their second round of sleep. So, in some ways, the religious world kept the rhythm alive longer than anyone else. Why did it disappear? So why don't we still do this? The short answer is light bulbs. Well, before that, oil lamps and gas lamps. Once people could keep the evening bright, they shifted bedtime later. Instead of going to bed at 9 p.m., you might go to bed at 11 or midnight. That naturally squashed the first sleep window. By the 18th century, the language of first sleep started disappearing from records. By the 19th, hardly anyone remembered it. And by the 20th century, doctors were telling people the normal way to sleep was one uninterrupted block. Ironically, what used to be natural started sounding pathological. But the traces never went away completely. Insomniacs today often wake up in the middle of the night and panic. Sleep researchers say, well, historically, that's just your body trying to revive an old pattern. You're not broken, you're medieval. Sleep as social life. One of the things I love about this whole topic is how it makes you realize that sleep used to be social. We think of it as private now, a little box of hours you carve out for yourself. But back then, it was noisy, communal, full of little rituals. People shared beds constantly. Families piled in together. Guests were offered not just a meal, but a share of the mattress. Servants might sleep at the foot of a master's bed. So when people woke up for that midnight interlude, they weren't alone scrolling on a glowing rectangle. They were chatting, praying, or maybe arguing with the person right next to them. It's funny and a little sad that we've lost that. Now waking up at 2 a.m. feels isolating. Back then, it was just what you did. There's also something dreamy about that in-between period. Contemporary writers described it as a liminal time. The body rested, the mind drifting. It was considered perfect for reflection or even mystical experiences. Dreams from first sleep were thought to be more vivid and meaningful. The hours between sleeps were almost like stepping into another world, halfway between waking and dreaming. Some even said that's when the veil between worlds was thinner, which sounds very spooky, though to a medieval villager, it was just normal life. A gentle example. Let's picture a peasant household around the year 1400. The cottage is cramped, smoky, maybe 6 or 7 people sleeping on a shared pallet of straw. They go to bed around 8 p.m. after a dinner of bread, beans, and maybe some salted pork if it's a lucky day. Around midnight, the room stirs. A couple gets up, stokes the fire, whispers a prayer. One child rolls over and mutters in their sleep. Another adult steps outside to relieve themselves, crunching over the frost. Maybe they look up at the stars for a minute, because what else are you going to do at 1 in the morning in 1400? Then, slowly, everyone drifts back down. Second sleep carries them to dawn. It's a rhythm that feels both alien and oddly soothing, like life used to have a pause button in the middle of the night. And with that, we'll leave the villagers tucked into their second sleep, drifting towards sunrise. Next time, we'll wander into some of the stranger corners of medieval rest habits because segmented sleep was only part of the picture. There were also nap cultures, bizarre medical advice, and of course royals who found a way to make even sleep look dysfunctional. But for now, let's let that image settle. A fire quietly burning, a room of sleepers, the quiet rustle of a world that divided its nights in two. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake, first of all, impressive. If you drifted off during part 1, no worries. That's kind of the whole point. Tonight we're continuing our gentle meander through the world of medieval sleeping habits. We left off with peasants snoozing through their first and second sleep, nestled in straw with maybe a goat in the corner for warmth. But, of course, medieval Europe wouldn't be medieval Europe if the upper classes didn't find a way to turn even sleep into something complicated, performative, and occasionally ridiculous. So, let's slip quietly into the royal bedchamber, where sleeping was less about rest and more about spectacle, politics, and occasionally just plain weirdness. Sleeping as a performance. For kings and queens, bedtime wasn't private. Far from it. In many royal courts, especially in France, England, and Spain, the act of going to bed was a literal ceremony. Yes, the monarch getting tucked in was treated like a public event. At Versailles in the 17th century, Louis XIV had an entire ritual called the coucher, where nobles competed for the honor of handing him his nightshirt. That's right, someone's big moment in life was helping a king change clothes. Imagine working your whole career to reach the high point of fastening a royal pajama button. Of course, the irony here is that Louis XIV didn't invent this tradition. Earlier medieval kings already had their bed ceremonies. The difference is that Louis industrialized the concept. But in both cases, the royal bed was more than furniture. It was a stage. So, while ordinary people slipped into straw pallets around 9 p.m., monarchs were lying down in public view, surrounded by courtiers pretending not to yawn. Noble beds as status objects. Beds themselves became extreme symbols of wealth. By the late Middle Ages, a noble bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a statement piece, like an over-the-top Instagram backdrop. Picture carved oak, embroidered curtains, velvet canopies. Beds could be so huge they doubled as social spaces. Some were wide enough to seat a small gathering. You'd literally host people in bed, reading petitions, eating meals, discussing politics. Today, if you had a meeting in bed, people would assume something scandalous. Back then, it was just Tuesday. And because beds were so expensive, they were often left to heirs in wills. A great bed might be worth more than land or livestock. In fact, there's a surviving giant called the Great Bed of Ware, built around 1590. It was over 3 meters wide and supposedly slept 12 people at once. Was that practical? Absolutely not. But in the world of noble bedding, practical was never the point. Monks and midnight alarms. Meanwhile, monks approached sleep with their usual flair for overcomplication. Monastic schedules were designed to interrupt sleep on purpose, because apparently resting like a normal person was far too indulgent. Take the Benedictines, for example. They structured their night around the divine office. That meant waking up around midnight for matins, chanting prayers in the cold chapel, then going back for a second round of sleep. Essentially, monks institutionalized first and second sleep. But here's the twist. They often made the first stretch shorter. Instead of a cozy 4 hours, they might sleep just a couple, wake up for chanting, and then try to make up the difference later. Some even napped in the daytime to balance things out. It was all about discipline. Sleep wasn't rest. It was another spiritual exercise. If you dozed off in chapel, you were scolded, which, let's be honest, must have happened a lot. Picture a room full of monks chanting in Latin at 2 a.m. in a freezing stone abbey. You'd absolutely drift. Medical advice about sleep. Now, medieval doctors also had opinions about how people should sleep, And as with most medieval medical advice, it was a weird mix of superstition and misplaced confidence. For starters, they thought sleeping on your left side was unhealthy because it supposedly squashed your internal organs. The right side was recommended instead. Though lying on your back was fine, if a bit spiritually risky, since demons were thought to attack sleepers in that position. Sweet dreams. Doctors also advised moderation. Too much sleep was sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins. Too little sleep, on the other hand, would dry out your humors and basically turn you into a cranky raisin. And of course, the midnight gap between first and second sleep was the perfect time for digestion to do its thing. So medical texts often encouraged people to have marital relations then, because why not double down? Romantic advice and digestion tips bundled together in one convenient package. The Royal Insomniacs. Naturally, some royals struggled with sleep, and because royals were never just people, their sleep problems became political issues. Take Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad. His reign in the late 14th and early 15th centuries was plagued with bouts of psychosis. He had insomnia, paranoia, and sometimes refused to bathe because he thought he was made of glass. Knights at his court must have been restless, to put it mildly. Or look at Henry IV of England, who suffered from mysterious ailments, possibly leprosy or epilepsy. Chronic sleeplessness was noted by his doctors, who naturally prescribed bloodletting, because if you're tired, why not also be anemic? And then there was Philip IV of Spain, nicknamed Philip the Planet King because he had so many titles orbiting around him. He was reportedly plagued by poor sleep and relied heavily on prayers and clerics to ease his mind. Considering the Habsburg jawline he inherited, maybe breathing at night was just structurally difficult. Beds as political arenas. The royal bed wasn't just for sleep. It was also a space of politics, literally. Monarchs received ambassadors in bed. They handed out favors from under the covers. The phrase bedchamber politics wasn't metaphorical, it was daily business. This blurred line between rest and rule created some odd scenes. Imagine trudging into a drafty castle chamber at dawn to discuss a treaty, only to find the king still under his embroidered covers, propped on pillows, trying to look majestic while probably just wishing he could go back to sleep. It also meant that the act of entering a royal bedroom was highly symbolic. To be allowed near the bed was a mark of enormous trust. Entire factions at court were built around who got to carry the royal candle or adjust the royal blanket. Yes, people schemed for the right to handle another man's sheets. Medieval politics really was just high-stakes high school. The disappearance of segmented sleep at court. Interestingly, royal courts were among the first to abandon the two-sleep rhythm. Why? Because they had the resources to stay up late. Candles, oil lamps, musicians, wine, all of these meant nights could be stretched artificially. So instead of tucking in around 9 p.m., kings and nobles often stayed up until midnight with banquets or games. That meant there was no first sleep to wake from, just one long snooze after the festivities finally ended. By the Renaissance, courts were bragging about how little they slept, as if exhaustion was a badge of honor, which, frankly, hasn't changed much. Just replace banquet with emails and you've got modern CEOs. The peasants keep their two sleeps. While nobles were busy pretending they didn't need rest, peasants quietly kept their two-sleep rhythm well into the early modern period. Farmers went to bed early, woke up in the middle of the night, and went back down before dawn. For them, segmented sleep wasn't just tradition, it was survival. Long nights demanded it, and waking at midnight was a chance to check animals, stir fires, or even guard against thieves. Life was precarious. Sleep had to adapt. It's only in the 18th and 19th centuries, when industrialization spread artificial light to more households, that ordinary folks began shifting toward the single block of sleep we know today. The sleep of children. One last note before we drift toward the next chapter.
Medieval children had their own messy relationship with sleep. For starters, kids didn't get their own beds unless they were royal. They piled in with parents, siblings, or servants. Infants were often swaddled tightly and laid beside their mothers. Unfortunately, this led to frequent accidents. Suffocation was tragically common. As for segmented sleep, children seem to have followed the same rhythms as adults, which makes sense. If everyone in the house wakes up at midnight, so do you. There are accounts of children being told stories or prayers in the in-between hours, making the midnight watch a kind of family bonding time. So, even for little ones, sleep was not the neat, separate 8-hour block we now insist on. It was communal, fractured, and deeply woven into daily life. Drifting toward the next chapter. So, here we are. We've seen peasants drifting through their first and second sleep, monks deliberately sabotaging their rest for God, and kings turning bedtime into political theater. It's a reminder that even something as basic as closing your eyes at night can be shaped by culture, class, and power. Sleep wasn't just biological, it was symbolic, and often a little absurd. Next time, we'll wander into the stranger corners of medieval medical advice, including how people thought dreams worked,
Why demons supposedly attacked sleepers, and how elite physicians managed to make rest sound like another dangerous activity, because of course they did. But for now, let's let the kings, peasants, and monks slip back under their covers into their second sleep, and we'll leave the candles burning low as dawn slowly creeps closer. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're here for part 3, then either you've been listening in order, or you just clicked into the middle because titles don't matter when you're already half asleep. Either way, we're floating deeper into medieval sleep culture tonight. So far, we've seen how peasants curled into their first and second sleeps, how monks turned rest into a midnight productivity exercise, and how kings basically hosted board meetings in bed. But sleep wasn't just about hours and rituals. It was also about what happened inside the mind. Because in the medieval imagination, dreams weren't random brain static. They were messages, warnings, even supernatural encounters. And with that came an entire ecosystem of advice, fears, and sometimes bizarre remedies. So let's wander gently into the medieval dreamscape, where sleep was less about REM cycles and more about whether God, demons, or last night's cheese was trying to send you a signal. Dreams as messages. The first thing to know, medieval Europeans didn't think dreams were meaningless. Quite the opposite. Dreams were believed to be significant, sometimes spiritual, sometimes medical. The church, predictably, was skeptical. Not every dream was from God, after all. Some were thought to come from demons, who slipped into your mind while your guard was down. Augustine of Hippo warned against trusting dreams too much, but at the same time, the Bible had dream prophets, Joseph, Daniel, so people couldn't exactly write them off either. The compromise? Dreams could be meaningful, but only if properly interpreted. Enter the medieval dream books. These were essentially guidebooks that told you what symbols meant. Dream of teeth falling out, bad omen. Dream of water? Depends. Clear water was good, muddy water not so much. Dream of flighting? That one usually meant pride or vanity. Basically, medieval dream interpretation was like a very pious version of a horoscope column. Demons in the night. But then there was the darker side. The belief that sleep left you vulnerable to demons, and not just metaphorical ones. The most famous culprit was the incubus or succubus, demons who supposedly pressed down on your chest while you slept, draining your energy, and yes, sometimes assaulting you in your dreams. People genuinely believed these encounters were real. The modern term sleep paralysis explains the feeling pretty well, but in the Middle Ages, they didn't have that vocabulary. They just assumed something heavy and evil was sitting on them. Artwork from the period shows demons crouched on sleepers' chests, looking smug and uncomfortable at the same time. If you've ever woken at 3 a.m. with your heart pounding, congratulations, you've had the medieval night hag experience.
Of course, theologians had a field day with this. Were the demons real? Was it just imagination? Opinions varied, but the result was the same. Sleeping flat on your back was considered risky, since it supposedly invited these nocturnal visitors. Side sleeping was spiritually safer. Saints and sleep visions. On the brighter side, sleep could also be a channel for holy visions. Plenty of saints were said to receive divine messages in dreams. Some even experienced mystical trances that blurred the line between sleep and wakefulness. For example, Saint Hildegard of Bingen described visions that came during a sort of waking dream state. To her, these weren't hallucinations. They were divine revelations. And because she was a respected abbess, people actually listened. Others weren't so lucky. Ordinary villagers claiming dream visions risked being accused of superstition or heresy. So dreams lived in this awkward space, respected when they happened to the right people, dangerous when they didn't. The medical angle on dreams. Medieval physicians also weighed in. Remember, this was the era of humoral theory, the idea that your health depended on balancing blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Doctors believed that dreams reflected the state of your body. So, if you dreamed of fire, it meant your body had too much heat. If you dreamed of water, you were overloaded with phlegm. A nightmare of being crushed, probably indigestion, which honestly is not that far from the modern observation that a heavy dinner leads to weird dreams. This humoral dream diagnosis was taken seriously. Doctors used it as part of their toolkit. Forget brain activity. The real question was whether your spleen had too much melancholy juice sloshing around. Strange sleep cures. Naturally, sleep disorders weren't new. Insomnia, nightmares, restless nights, people had them back then too. And medieval medicine offered a variety of cures, ranging from the oddly reasonable to the completely unhinged. One popular remedy for insomnia was lettuce. Yes, lettuce, because it was thought to have cooling, calming properties. Physicians recommended lettuce soup, lettuce wine, or just chewing on raw leaves before bed. Essentially, medieval Ambien was salad. Another cure was rubbing poppy juice on your temples, which makes sense since poppies contain opiates. That probably worked a little too well. For nightmares, people turned to amulets. A common one was inscribing certain psalms on parchment and hanging them around the neck, or, for the less pious, placing herbs like rue or valerian under the pillow. And yes, sometimes garlic, because apparently it wasn't just for vampires. And then there were the questionable ones, like carrying a hare's foot in your pocket, or, according to one recipe, sleeping with a roasted dormouse beside you. Don't ask me why. Medieval medicine had a way of throwing in a random rodent just to see what happened. Royal nightmares. Naturally, when royals had sleep problems, they made headlines. Chronic nightmares in particular were seen as ominous for the realm. Take Henry IV of England again. Yes, him with the mystery disease. He reportedly suffered terrible dreams, interpreted by his enemies as signs of divine judgment. Political opponents loved to spread stories of kings plagued by restless nights. It was propaganda gold. Or look at Emperor Constantine the Great, technically a bit earlier than medieval, but his story was recycled for centuries. He was said to have dreamed of the Christian cross before his big battle, which supposedly convinced him to convert. Whether true or not, it became the template for important dream changes the course of history. So, if you were a medieval king and had a bad night's sleep, there was always a risk someone would turn it into a political omen. Oh, the king dreamed of falling last night? Clearly the monarchy is doomed. Back to dream books and fortune-telling for a moment, because these things were everywhere. They were often copied alongside herbal manuals and prayer guides, passed down from antiquity. Some traced their roots back to Greek and Arabic traditions, so they were part of a long global fascination. The fun part is how oddly specific they could be. For example, dreaming of catching fish was good luck. But dreaming of eating fish was bad. Dreaming of losing a tooth meant death in the family, but dreaming of gaining teeth meant wealth. Basically, your subconscious was trying to send you a cryptic text message, and you needed a manual to decode it. Were they accurate? Of course not, but people clung to them, because when your daily life was uncertain, famine, plague, war, dreams felt like one of the few places you might glimpse the future. Sleep and sin. There was also a moral angle. Sleep itself wasn't sinful, but too much of it was. Laziness, sloth, it was all spiritually dangerous. Preachers regularly warned against oversleeping, especially in the mornings. The devil, they said, loved nothing more than a man who stayed in bed past sunrise. At the same time, nighttime temptations were seen as risky. Impure dreams, lustful thoughts, even just tossing and turning, these could all be framed as moral failings. It was exhausting, really. Imagine feeling guilty for how you slept. Medieval life didn't let you off the hook for anything. Nighttime in the village. Let's zoom out for a moment. We've talked about royals and monks, but what about ordinary villagers, lying awake after first sleep, staring into the dark? In those hours between sleeps, dreams might be shared aloud. Families told each other what they'd seen. Some households even had little rituals, saying a quick prayer to banish bad dreams before heading back to bed. The communal nature of it meant dreams weren't private secrets. They were part of the family conversation, woven into daily life. You could wake at midnight, tell your spouse you dreamed of wolves, and by morning, the whole village might know. And depending on the interpretation, people might genuinely worry or celebrate based on it. So sleep wasn't just personal. It was public, communal, even political. Transitioning toward morning. And then came the second sleep. After the midnight interval, people drifted back down. Second sleep often lasted until dawn, when animals stirred and church bells rang. Dreams in the second sleep were thought to be less important, more influenced by digestion than divinity. So, ironically, if you wanted a prophetic dream, you wanted it early in the night. Later dreams were basically written off as the result of too much cheese.
Settling the night. So here's where we land for tonight. In a medieval bed, the fire dim, a dream lingering in the mind. Was it a vision from God, a whisper from a demon, or just indigestion? Nobody could really say. What we do know is that sleep was never just passive. It was loaded with meaning, rules, remedies, and fears. Even in the most private hours, the medieval world found ways to make rest a social and spiritual drama. Next time, we'll wander into the strange economics of sleep, who got to nap, who didn't, and how word schedules shaped the rhythm of rest. Because, of course, sleep was also about class. And naturally, nobles and peasants couldn't even nap the same way. But for now, let's let the dreams fade. The second sleep is calling, and dawn, somewhere in the distance, is already creeping in.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still here, either you've been binging this medieval sleep saga like it's the slowest Netflix series ever, or you're already unconscious and this is just background noise. Either way, we're continuing tonight with a look at naps, work schedules, and how rest itself became yet another reflection of medieval class divisions. Because, as it turns out, not everyone could just curl up for 2 neat chunks of night sleep and call it a day, or rather a night. Daily work rhythms, social expectations, and even the weather shaped when people could rest. And, as always, the elites found ways to nap luxuriously, while the peasants, well, let's just say their nap usually involved collapsing in a field when nobody was watching. So, let's drift into the rhythms of the medieval day. The workday without clocks. The first thing to remember is that most medieval people didn't live by precise mechanical clocks. Sure, monasteries and some towns had water clocks and later bells regulated hours. But for the average villager, time was more about rhythms of light, seasons, and tasks. That meant sleep schedules were flexible. In winter, nights were long, so people got more segmented rest. In summer, days were long, so nights were short, and people compensated with naps. Farmers in particular followed the sun. Up at dawn, heavy work until midday, and then, if the season allowed, a rest in the heat of the afternoon. It wasn't called siesta, since that's more of a Mediterranean term, but the logic was the same. Break the day with a nap when the sun is high. And of course, if you were a lord or a monk, your nap could be quite official. If you were a peasant, it was whatever you could sneak in between hauling hay and praying you didn't drop dead of exhaustion. The monastic schedule. Monks naturally had the most regimented naps. Their lives were literally built around the canonical hours, set times of prayer, starting before dawn and going until night. To fit all that chanting in, monks often broke up their sleep even more than ordinary villagers. After matins at midnight, they'd sometimes grab a nap before lauds at dawn. Then, depending on the order, a short nap in the afternoon was permitted. Some stricter orders frowned on it, others embraced it. The Cistercians, for instance, were known for cutting back sleep as a form of discipline, because nothing says holiness like walking around perpetually drowsy. What's funny is that monasteries ended up preserving a kind of biphasic or polyphasic sleep schedule long after laypeople moved towards single blocks. In other words, monks were the original polyphasic sleep influencers centuries before YouTubers started boasting about surviving on just 4 hours a night. The nobles and the luxury nap. If you were a noble, though, naps weren't less about survival, more about indulgence. Aristocrats had the luxury of choosing when to rest. After a big midday meal, which for them could include multiple courses, wine, and sweetmeats, it was entirely normal to withdraw for a little lie-down. Sometimes this was framed as good health. Doctors encouraged rest after eating, especially for the wealthy, who had heavier diets than peasants. But often, it was simply a status symbol. You could nap because you didn't have to work the fields. This division was noticed. Peasant complaints about lazy nobles weren't just about taxes, they also resented the fact that lords could lounge after lunch while everyone else had to keep digging ditches. Naps were a marker of inequality, as much as fine clothes or castles. Peasant naps. For peasants, daytime sleep was more survival tactic than luxury. During harvest, laborers might rise before dawn, work straight through, and then catch a short nap in the field, literally lying down on their tools. Other times, sleep was grabbed in awkward bursts, 10 minutes leaning against a hayrick, half an hour beside the oxen. Longer rest did happen in winter when work slowed, but in high season, peasants had no official nap window. If anything, resting too long could be seen as laziness and punished by overseers. So, while nobles had siestas on feather beds, peasants had micro-naps in the dirt. Very different vibes. Naps in town life. In towns and cities, things got a little more complicated. Craftsmen and apprentices often worked long hours, starting at sunrise and continuing into evening bells. For them, the midday meal break was sometimes the only pause. Whether that included a nap depended on the master's temperament. Some were generous, others were less so. But records suggest that townsfolk also adopted segmented sleep at night, so naps weren't always necessary. Instead, they leaned into those midnight waking hours as their break time. You might rise at midnight, do a bit of spinning, read by candle if you could afford it, or even do accounts. Basically a graveyard shift before going back to bed. Sleep and gender roles. It's also worth mentioning how gender shaped sleep. Women's rest was often more fragmented than men's, thanks to childcare. Nursing mothers in particular were frequently awake during those midnight hours, which fit conveniently with the first and second sleep pattern, but it meant women rarely got long, uninterrupted blocks of rest. We even find medical texts scolding women for oversleeping in the mornings, apparently ignoring the fact that they've been up half the night feeding babies, tending fires, or praying. So, yes, even in the Middle Ages, women were criticized for not getting their rest right while simultaneously being denied rest in the first place. Sleep as a social divider. By now, you've probably noticed the pattern. Who slept, when they slept, and how much they slept was less about biology than about status. Nobles could nap whenever they pleased because their labor was performed by others. Monks had regimented but privileged rest, often with special accommodations like heated dormitories. Peasants scraped together sleep around brutal work demands. And this wasn't lost on contemporaries. Writers often complained that the wealthy were literally sleeping their lives away while the poor worked themselves into the grave. One preacher even warned that noble siestas were sinful idleness, but of course, no lord actually stopped napping because of it. Sleeping in public. Another curious thing, in the Middle Ages, sleeping in public wasn't considered shameful in the way it often is now. Nodding off at church? Pretty common. Dozing during a long sermon? Almost expected. Travelers slept in inns, alehouses, even in fields. Pilgrims on the road often curled up at shrines or church porches. Public napping was simply part of life. In towns, apprentices might nap on workbenches. In villages, shepherds napped by hedgerows. This blurred boundary between private and public sleep reminds us that bedtime wasn't as neatly contained as it is today. Sleep spilled into every corner of life because exhaustion didn't care about social rules. Festivals and sleep deprivation. There were also times when entire communities disrupted their sleep together. Festivals, vigils, feast days. Staying awake all night was sometimes a religious duty, especially before major holidays. Villages might gather in churches for vigils, chanting, praying, and probably nodding off in shifts. Carnivals, on the other hand, encouraged the opposite, drinking, dancing, and deliberately avoiding sleep. These all-night parties left people stumbling through the next day in a haze. In other words, medieval Europe knew the hangover walk of shame long before college towns perfected it. The fragile balance. When we step back, what we see is that medieval sleep was a balancing act. Too little rest was dangerous, exhaustion led to illness. Too much rest was suspicious, evidence of sloth. And only certain classes were allowed to nap without judgment. Doctors, priests, and rulers all weighed in, turning sleep into a moral and social battlefield. And the irony is that through all this, people still mostly followed what their bodies demanded, sleeping in segments, grabbing naps when possible, and drifting off wherever exhaustion caught them. A village afternoon. Let's end tonight's wander with an image. Picture a village, around the year 1300. The sun is high, work in the fields has slowed for a brief midday pause. Peasants sit in the shade, eating coarse bread and cheese. A few lie down in the grass, hats pulled over their faces. Children nap in their mothers' laps. Meanwhile, in the manor house nearby, the lord reclines on a padded couch, a servant fanning him gently as he dozes after a rich meal. And in the monastery on the hill, monks debate whether they're allowed a short nap before returning to chant known. Three very different versions of rest. Same sun overhead, same need for sleep, but three separate worlds of permission, judgment, and comfort. So, here we are. Naps weren't just biological. They were cultural, political, and moral. Sleep wasn't equal. Like food, clothing, or land, it was distributed unevenly. Some people rested in luxury, others barely rested at all. Next time, we'll explore how sleep shaped death culture. Because yes, the medieval world was full of eerie overlaps between how people thought about sleep and how they thought about dying. The line between the two was surprisingly thin. But for now, let's close the shutters, let the peasants, monks, and nobles drift back into whatever form of rest they could manage, and leave the afternoon fading gently into evening.
Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still listening, that probably means one of two things. Either you've completely surrendered to the hypnotic charms of medieval bedtime trivia, or you're lying in the dark, half asleep, and just letting my voice rattle on like a medieval sermon nobody asked for. Either way, tonight's chapter is going to get a little darker. Not dramatic dark, don't worry, just gently, morbidly medieval dark. Because in the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't just about rest. It was also tangled up with death, the afterlife, and the ever-present possibility that you might not wake up again.
And when you live in a world where plague, famine, or some angry horse could finish you off at any moment, that wasn't an abstract fear. It was a daily reality. So let's ease into the eerie ways people connected falling asleep with falling into eternal rest. The little death before the little black dress. First, the language itself. Medieval writers often described sleep as a kind of little death, which makes sense. You close your eyes, you lose consciousness, your body goes limp. In a world without scientific explanations for REM cycles, it wasn't a huge leap to see sleep as rehearsing your own funeral. We even find Latin prayers comparing the bed to the grave. Lullabies whispered to children sometimes slipped in references to eternal rest. Nothing like tucking in your toddler with the reminder that life is fleeting. Sweet dreams, little one. This wasn't seen as morbid in the modern sense, though it was comforting. To fall asleep was to practice dying in Christ, so that when the real thing came, you were already in rhythm. The bed as coffin. Beds themselves reflected this overlap. Wealthy people often had heavy wooden bed frames with curtains that could be pulled shut. Step inside, draw the drapes, and you were basically lying in a private coffin-shaped box. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. For the poor, beds were simpler. Straw pallets on the floor, but even then, the language of lying down for the last time blurred the line between daily rest and eternal rest. Medieval art shows this often. Figures in bed look almost identical to figures on their deathbeds, which is probably why bedtime prayers were so common. Bedtime prayers, morbid but comforting. Speaking of which, no medieval evening was complete without some kind of prayer about dying in your sleep. One of the most popular was a version of Psalm 4. In peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. The idea was simple. You surrender the night to God in case you don't make it to morning. Children learned little rhyming versions too. Some early forms go something like, if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Yes, that old nursery prayer that still unsettles kids today goes all the way back. It's essentially medieval death prep disguised as a lullaby. So every night, people tucked themselves in with a reminder that death was never far. Not exactly what you'd call relaxing, but apparently it did the job. Deathbeds and sleep beds. The overlap went both ways. Just as beds were imagined as coffins, coffins were sometimes imagined as beds. Epitaphs describe the dead as resting in sleep. Tomb carvings often show figures lying flat, hands folded neatly, as if tucked in for an eternal nap. And when someone actually did die, the ritual often began in their literal bed. The sick were surrounded by candles, prayers, and watchers. When the end came, their bed became their death stage. It's why heirs inherited not just castles, but beds as prized possessions. Beds were both the setting of life's beginning and its end. Night fears. Of course, not everyone drifted into sleep serenely. Nights carried their own terrors. For one thing, death in sleep was common enough. Sudden illness, fire, or even just the cold could claim a sleeper quietly. Medieval people were aware of this, which meant a lingering fear. What if tonight's sleep doesn't end in waking? This gave rise to stories of nocturnal demons. The infamous incubus or succubus was often blamed for deaths during sleep. What we'd now call sleep paralysis, waking with a feeling of weight on your chest, was explained as a demon sitting on you, trying to steal your soul. Comforting. And of course, those midnight hours between first and second sleep were prime time for anxieties to surface. You're awake, it's pitch black, the fire is low, and you've just been reminded that sleep is practice for death. Cue the intrusive thoughts. But dreams and the other world. But not all was fear. Dreams were also taken seriously as glimpses into the spiritual world. If sleep was a cousin of death, then dreams were like sneak previews of heaven, hell, or purgatory. Medieval dream manuals were surprisingly popular. People believed you could decode divine messages from dreams. Some dreams were warnings, others prophecies, others temptations sent by demons. And since everyone woke in the middle of the night anyway, dreams became dinner table conversation, except at midnight by candlelight, surrounded by shadows. So the night watch wasn't just a time for prayer or chores, it was also a time for dream analysis. You could picture someone in the year 1350 waking up from a strange dream, quietly pondering whether it meant their cousin was going to die or if they'd just eaten too much cabbage at supper. The church and sleep as salvation. Naturally, the church had opinions. Priests often reminded people that sleep was a rehearsal for the final judgment. Go to bed with a clean conscience or risk waking up in hell, which is basically the medieval version of don't go to bed angry, except much more terrifying. Monastic writers described each night as a trial run. Lay yourself down, imagine it's your last, commend your soul to God. This wasn't supposed to scare, exactly. It was meant to keep you mindful. Life was fragile. Every nap was a chance to practice letting go. The good death versus the bad death. This connection between sleep and death also fed into the medieval obsession with the good death. To die peacefully in your bed, surrounded by family and priests, was the ideal. To die suddenly, in your sleep, without confession, was dangerous. It meant no last rites, no absolution, no time to prepare. So, paradoxically, dying in your sleep was both feared and envied. Feared because it was spiritually risky, envied because it was gentle. A reminder that medieval sleep was never just innocent rest. It always carried that shadow of finality. The night vigil of the dead, and if death actually did happen, the overlap continued. After someone died, the community often held a vigil through the night. The body lay out, candles flickering, watchers praying. It looked a lot like an inverted sleep. One person lying motionless, others staying awake through the night beside them. This mirrored the rhythms of ordinary segmented sleep. Just as you woke at midnight to pray for yourself, you might also stay awake at midnight to pray for the soul of the departed. Night was when the line between life and death felt thinnest. A village night revisited. Picture it again. In that same village around the year 1300. The peasants are sleeping in their huts, drifting between first and second sleep. Some wake to stoke the fire, some whisper prayers. But in one house, the rhythm is different. An old man has died in his bed. Candles glow, neighbors gather, murmuring psalms. His body lies as if merely asleep, hands folded. Outside, dogs bark in the night. Inside, the line between sleeping and dying feels paper-thin. This was the medieval night, a place where ordinary rest and eternal rest brushed against each other constantly. Sleep as a reminder of mortality. So if we pull back, what do we see? Medieval people lived with death constantly. Plague, war, childbirth, famine. Sleep became both escape from that and a nightly reminder of it. You lay down, prayed your soul safe, and drifted off into a rehearsal for the grave. And yet, this wasn't depressing to them. It was grounding. In a way, it made every night a little act of surrender, and every morning a kind of resurrection. Waking up wasn't taken for granted. It was celebrated, because you had made it through. Closing the night. So as you drift tonight, imagine yourself in a medieval bed. The shutters are closed, the fire glows faintly. You've said your prayers, committing your soul to God. You draw the bed curtains shut, cocooned like in a wooden coffin. You let your eyes close, thinking of it as a little death, but also as practice. Because with luck, you'll wake up again for the second sleep. And if not, well, at least you are ready. And that's where we'll leave it for now. Sleep as a shadow of death, a nightly brush with eternity. Next time, we'll wander into dream culture, because medieval people not only took their dreams seriously, they wrote entire dream manuals, decoded symbols, and sometimes built life decisions around what they saw at night. But for now, let's rest. with one foot in the world of the living and the other gently touching the world beyond.
Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still here, congratulations. You've officially outlasted about 99% of people who clicked on this video and fell asleep before part 2. That means you either have a serious tolerance for slow historical rambling, or you're one of those people who listens to this kind of thing while doing the dishes. Either way, you're in good company. Tonight, we're floating deeper into the world of medieval night culture, specifically dreams. Because for medieval people, dreams weren't just random brain static. They were portals, symbols, coded messages from God. Or from the devil if you were unlucky. Basically, Freud with less cocaine and more demons. So let's drift into the dream world of the Middle Ages, where everything from cabbages to comets could mean something about your immortal soul. The weight of dreams. Dreams mattered. They were taken seriously by almost everyone: peasants, nobles, monks, doctors, and of course, the ever-opinionated clergy. The Bible itself was full of dream stories: Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, angels delivering messages at night, apocalyptic visions. So the church couldn't just dismiss dreams. They had to deal with them. The consensus was that dreams came in 3 types: divine, natural, and demonic. Divine dreams were sent by God. These were usually clear, powerful, and left you with that holy glow. Natural dreams were just your body processing stuff, like the dream manuals that claimed you only dreamt about fish if you'd overeaten fish stew. Yes, very scientific. Demonic dreams were temptations, tricks, or terrifying nightmares meant to pull you off the righteous path. The problem, of course, was telling them apart. Was that dream about a golden ladder a message from heaven, or just indigestion from too much onion soup? Hard to say. The dream books. To help with this, people turned to dream manuals. These were surprisingly popular. One famous example was the Somnalia Danielis, Daniel's dream book. It floated around Europe in multiple versions, claiming to trace back to the biblical prophet Daniel, though really it was just medieval people winging it. The manuals worked like dictionaries. You looked up an image, and it told you what it meant. Dream of dogs? Depends. A friendly dog could mean loyalty. An angry dog could mean betrayal. Dream of bread? Good fortune. Dream of moldy bread? Misfortune. Dream of riding a pig? Honestly, not a great omen, but also, what did you eat before bed? The funny thing is how specific these guides could get. Dreaming of teeth falling out, for instance, was usually taken as a sign someone close to you would die, which is unfortunate because medieval dentistry wasn't exactly stellar. People were probably dreaming of losing teeth all the time. Peasant dreams versus noble dreams. Class shaped dream culture too. Peasants often saw dreams as practical omens, signs of weather, harvest, or illness. A dream of overflowing water might mean flooding. A dream of fat cattle might promise a good year. Nobles, on the other hand, framed dreams as divine guidance for politics and war. Chronicles are full of stories where kings claim they saw their victory or their downfall in a dream. Sometimes this was real belief. Other times it was convenient PR. Oh, I didn't just invade France because I felt like it. God literally told me in a dream. Sure, buddy. The clergy's dilemma. The church had a complicated relationship with dreams. On one hand, they were in the Bible, so you couldn't just dismiss them. On the other hand, people were using dreams to make big life decisions without asking priests first, which was clearly unacceptable. So the official line became, some dreams are divine, but most are nonsense or demonic. Better safe than sorry. Monks were even warned not to trust dreams too much lest the devil sneak in while they were dozing. This tension played out in sermons. Priests scolded congregations for gossiping about dreams, even while parishioners kept doing it anyway. Because let's be honest, telling someone about your dream has always been irresistible, even when it's boring. So then I was flying, but I wasn't really flying, and then my dead grandmother gave me a chicken. Medieval or modern, the vibe hasn't changed. Dreams as medicine. Interestingly, doctors also weighed in. Medieval medicine linked dreams to the humors, the 4 bodily fluids that supposedly determined your health. If you had too much black bile, you'd have gloomy dreams. too much blood, you'd have passionate or violent ones. Too much phlegm, and you'd probably dream of swimming because why not? Doctors sometimes used patients' dreams as diagnostic tools. If someone reported constant nightmares of fire, it might mean they had a fever. Dreams of drowning? Maybe lung issues. It wasn't accurate science, but it shows how tightly dreams were woven into everyday thought. The midnight dream circle. Remember that gap between first and second sleep? That was prime dream time. People woke, shared their dreams with each other, and sometimes even tried to interpret them right then and there. Imagine a 14th century peasant sitting by the hearth, telling his half-asleep wife, "So I dreamed the oxen were flying again. Do you think that means rain?" Families and neighbors discussed dreams in the same casual way we talk about the weather. Dreams weren't private, mysterious things. They were communal. Everyone had a say in what they meant, whether they were prophecies or just gas. Famous medieval dreams. A few famous dream stories show how seriously they could be taken. For example, before the Battle of Hastings in 1066, both Harold Godwinson and William the Conqueror supposedly had ominous dreams. Chroniclers later used these to frame the Norman invasion as divinely ordained. Convenient, right? Or take Emperor Constantine, who, long before the Middle Ages, claimed to have seen a cross in a dream before a crucial battle. That story circulated for centuries as proof that God intervened through dreams. Dreams like these were political tools. You could legitimize wars, dynasties, or church councils just by claiming divine dream guidance. Nobody could prove you didn't dream it, after all. Nightmares and night terrors. Of course, not all dreams were reassuring. Nightmares carried particular weight. The word nightmare itself originally referred to a supernatural being that sat on your chest and suffocated you in your sleep. This is where sleep paralysis comes back into the story. Medieval sufferers often described a crushing weight, inability to move, and terrifying visions. They believed demons, witches, or restless spirits were attacking them. Artwork from the period even shows grotesque little goblins squatting on sleepers' chests. Subtle? Not really. Effective? Definitely. Nightmares were sometimes taken as warnings. A bad dream meant you should pray harder, confess sins, or even change your plans. People might delay travel if they dreamed badly the night before. Nightmares weren't brushed off. They could alter real-world choices. Dreams and the afterlife. Since sleep was so closely linked to death, dreams often became imagined previews of the afterlife. People reported visions of heaven's light or hell's torments during sleep. Priests encouraged this idea, using dreams as teaching tools. Like, if you dream of fire, maybe that's God warning you about eternal fire. Nice bedtime story. In fact, some saints were said to receive visions of purgatory during sleep, which they then used to urge the living to pray for the dead. This gave ordinary dreams a cosmic weight. Your restless night might be a literal glimpse beyond the grave. A village dream scene. Let's pause and picture it again. A village night around 1320. Families lie on straw pallets, drifting between first and second sleep. A boy awakens suddenly from a nightmare, convinced a shadowy beast sat on his chest. He stirs the embers, whispers a prayer. His sister mumbles about her dream of clear water and bread, which her mother takes as a hopeful sign. Outside, the church bell tolls for matins, echoing across fields. Dreams ripple quietly through the night, frightening, comforting, mysterious. By morning, they'll be retold and reinterpreted, woven into the fabric of village life. The gentle divide. So what does all this tell us? That for medieval people, the mind didn't turn off at night. Sleep was active, meaningful, risky. Dreams were bridges between the human and the divine, the natural and the supernatural. Today, we tend to shrug at dreams, maybe Google them for fun. But in the Middle Ages, they were guidance systems, medical charts, spiritual warnings, and sometimes excuses for political conquest. They mattered. And yet, despite all this seriousness, they also gave people something very human. Stories to share, mysteries to puzzle over, little glimmers of hope or fear to carry into the day. Closing the dream chapter. So as you drift tonight, Imagine yourself in a medieval bed. Curtains drawn, fire low, prayers said. You fall into first sleep, then wake in the hush of midnight. You sit up, share a dream, maybe wonder if it's from God or just cabbage stew. Then you lie back down, drifting into the second sleep, carrying visions of ladders, beasts, or endless bread. Dreams were not just dreams. They were part of the great nightly rhythm of life. And that brings us to the end of dreams. Next time, we'll glide into how people actually woke up, because alarm clocks weren't a thing yet, and medieval mornings were full of roosters, bells, and sometimes very grumpy monks dragging each other out of bed. But for now, let your own dreams come, whether prophetic, nonsensical, or just cozy.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still with me, then you've either developed a strange loyalty to medieval peasants and their straw mattresses, or you just haven't bothered to switch this video off because it's easier to let it drone on while you drift. Either way, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're talking about mornings, specifically how medieval people woke up. Because while today we have buzzing alarms, phone screens, and the occasional cat pawing your face at 6 a.m., people back then had their own set of natural and social alarm clocks. And just like everything else, waking up looked very different if you were a peasant, a monk, or a lord. So, let's crack open those shuttered windows, shake out the straw, and see what medieval mornings really looked like. The natural alarm, roosters, and light. The classic wake-up call in villages was, of course, the rooster. Yes, it really did happen. Chickens were everywhere, and roosters don't exactly whisper. Crowing at dawn was such a reliable feature of rural life that it became symbolic of morning itself. But light mattered even more. Most houses didn't have thick curtains, so once dawnlight came creeping through cracks and shutters, people stirred. Farmers needed to make the most of daylight, so rising early wasn't just a choice, it was survival. Winter mornings were slower, with long darkness stretching into late hours. Summer mornings? You could be up at 4 a.m. ready to haul hay before the heat set in, which, by the way, made roosters extremely unpopular with anyone who wanted to pretend sunrise wasn't happening yet. The communal alarm, church bells. In towns and monasteries, bells were the real alarm clocks. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, and so on, structured the day. The first bell after dawn, often around 6 a.m., was prime. That bell was basically the medieval equivalent of your iPhone ringtone, only louder, less ignorable, and rung by some poor sacristan who'd already been awake for hours. For lay people in towns, bells marked time for work too. Bakers, butchers, smiths, they all started with the sound of church bells echoing across the streets. And unlike today, where you can technically ignore your alarm, medieval bells were community-wide. If you didn't get up, your neighbors definitely noticed. Monastic wake-ups. Monks, naturally, had the harshest mornings. Their day often began in the middle of the night with matins around midnight or 2 a.m. They'd rise from their communal dormitories, shuffle to the church, chant prayers, then sometimes nap before lauds at dawn. Picture dozens of sleepy monks fumbling into cold cloisters by candlelight. Some chroniclers admit monks fell asleep during prayers. Can't blame them. Sleep deprivation was basically built into the system. But the point was discipline. You trained your body to wake up for God's time, not your own. Which, let's be honest, sounds like medieval boot camp with chanting. Peasant wake-ups. For peasants, mornings were practical. Up with the light, tend the animals, stoke the hearth, fetch water. Breakfast, if there was one, came later, usually just bread, maybe with ale or milk. Nothing fancy. Children helped too. Chasing chickens, gathering kindling. Waking up wasn't a quiet, personal ritual. It was noisy, crowded, full of tasks. Picture 6 people in a one-room cottage, all getting up at once, stepping over each other, trying not to trip into the fire. Very different from the serene, slow mornings lifestyle blogs talk about. Noble wake-ups. Nobles, meanwhile, woke more slowly. Their mornings involved attendants, sometimes a valet literally pulling back curtains and helping them dress. The timing was more flexible. Lords didn't have to catch the sunrise if they didn't want to, unless, of course, they were heading off to hunt, which often required brutal early starts. But generally, the upper classes enjoyed softer mornings. They could linger in bed, receive visitors, or even conduct business while still under blankets, a kind of half-sleepy state where decisions about taxes or land disputes were made before the lord had even washed his face. Imagine losing your farm rights because your baron was cranky before breakfast. Alarm by human proxy. Another interesting detail. Some people literally acted as alarm clocks. In towns, apprentices or servants were often tasked with waking their masters. If you worked for a craft guild, you didn't just get yourself up. You sometimes went door to door waking others, especially before big workdays. Later, in early modern Europe, there were knocker-uppers, people hired to bang on windows with sticks to wake households. While not strictly medieval, the principle existed earlier in communal settings. One person awake ensured everyone else got moving. So if you were a heavy sleeper, you basically relied on someone smacking you into consciousness. What about oversleeping? Oversleeping wasn't just frowned upon, it was moralized. Priests gave sermons about sloth, using late risers as examples of sin. Waking up early was seen as virtuous, productive, godly. Sleeping in was wasteful, lazy, even suspicious. Writers often scolded nobles for staying in bed past sunrise. One chronicler sneered that kings who lingered in bed ended up ruling badly, which, honestly, might be true, but also feels like a cheap shot. Meanwhile, peasants didn't even have the option of oversleeping. Your animals would scream for food before you got the chance. Morning chores and rituals. So what actually happened once people woke up? For peasants, animals first, then fire, then work. For townsfolk, setting up shop, prepping tools, heading to the market. For monks, chanting, studying, manual labor. For nobles, grooming, breakfast if they felt like it, sometimes even morning prayers in bed. Washing was minimal, maybe a quick splash of cold water or just wiping with a cloth. Full baths weren't daily, so mornings were more about good enough hygiene than glowing skin routines. Tooth care? At best, a quick rub with a cloth or a chew stick. And then off you went, breath and all. Breakfast or not. Here's another surprise. Medieval people didn't always eat breakfast. For peasants, a small bite was normal, but many waited until mid-morning or even noon for the first proper meal. Partly because food was limited, partly because eating early was considered a luxury. Monks often skipped breakfast altogether as a form of discipline. Nobles had the option, of course, but a grand breakfast wasn't standard until much later. So waking up didn't mean pancakes and coffee. It usually meant just ale and bread. Fuel, not comfort. The pace of mornings. We also forget how slow mornings could be. Without electric light, mornings began dimly. Fires needed to be stoked, chores lined up, tools gathered. People often moved in quiet, chilly half-light. The day ramped up slowly, reaching full activity only after the sun was fully up. Compare that to our world of instant brightness and 24/7 schedules. Medieval mornings were gradual, a kind of slow dawn routine, not because people were relaxed, but because nature forced it. The symbolism of dawn. Dawn also carried moral and spiritual weight. Writers loved to compare waking at dawn with rising to a holy life. Roosters even became symbols of vigilance and resurrection. Churches sometimes put rooster-shaped weather vanes on steeples to reminders to stay spiritually awake. So, when you dragged yourself out of bed at sunrise, You weren't just starting your chores, you were enacting a kind of spiritual metaphor. Sleep symbolized death. Dawn symbolized rebirth, which is poetic, if you ignore the fact that most peasants were just groaning and swearing as they reached for their boots. A village morning. Let's picture it again. A village around 1300. The rooster crows, light creeps in through shutters. A woman rises first, stirring the fire. Children groan awake, pulling on rough wool clothes. A man heads out to check the oxen. The smell of smoke, animals, and damp straw fills the room. Down the road, the church bell rings. Neighbors emerge from their huts, yawning, stretching, trudging to fields. Morning is not peaceful, it's busy, noisy, communal. The entire village wakes up together, bound by roosters, bells, and the demands of survival. The noble morning. Meanwhile, in the manor house, curtains are pulled back. A lord sits up, attended by servants. Perhaps he sips wine or hears news from a steward. He has the luxury of choosing his pace, hunting at dawn or lying in longer. Either way, his mornings are cushioned by others' labor. This contrast, once again, shows how even waking up was class-specific. One group jolted into labor by necessity. Another eased into the day by privilege. The rhythm restored. So waking up in the Middle Ages wasn't just about shaking off sleep. It was about sliding back into the rhythm of work, prayer, and survival.
Morning was communal, moralized, sometimes luxurious, often exhausting. And like everything else, it was another way the medieval day reinforced inequality. Some people greeted the sunrise in fields, bent to toil. Others greeted it under feather blankets, sipping wine. Same dawn, different worlds. Closing the morning. So, as we wrap this part, imagine the medieval morning, roosters calling, bells ringing, fires crackling, peasants trudging to fields, monks chanting in cold chapels, nobles stretching in curtained beds, a whole society blinking into daylight together, each class in its own rhythm, all tied to the sun. And with that, we've moved from night to day. Next time, we'll explore sleep environments themselves. Beds, bedding, chambers, who shared with whom, and just how crowded things could get when 6 people piled into one straw mattress. Spoiler, very crowded. For now, though, let's leave the village at dawn, the bell still echoing, and drift gently back into our own quiet. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still with me, then either you've officially committed to learning way more about medieval sleep than you ever thought possible, or you're asleep already and this is just drifting through your subconscious. Either way, good news. We finally made it to the beds themselves. Because as fun as it is to talk about dreams, midnight prayers, and cranky roosters, none of it means much if we don't look at where medieval people were actually sleeping. Spoiler, it wasn't all romantic canopies and feather beds. In fact, for most people, medieval bedding was basically one step above camping. So tonight, let's slowly shuffle through cottages, monasteries, and castles, and take a nice, drowsy look at the world of medieval beds. The peasant bed. Let's start at the bottom. Literally, most peasants slept close to the ground. Think simple wooden frames or no frame at all. A sack stuffed with straw, hay, or sometimes leaves served as a mattress. These were called palliasse beds. And yes, they got lumpy, dusty, and itchy very fast. Bedding wasn't washed often because, well, you try stuffing clean straw into a sack every week. Usually the straw was swapped out seasonally, maybe twice a year if you were lucky, which meant that over time, beds got, let's say, aromatic. Add in damp cottages, smoke from the hearth, and maybe a few chickens wandering inside, and it was not exactly the lavender-scented paradise we imagine. Shared sleeping. Another key detail. Beds were almost always shared. Families often slept in the same bed or in the same single-room space. Parents, children, sometimes even grandparents. Privacy wasn't a thing. If you had a new baby, into the bed they went. It wasn't just family either. In some inns or guest houses, strangers were thrown into the same bed for the night.
Imagine traveling, paying for a bed, and then realizing you're spooning with a wool merchant from 3 towns over. Cozy. This wasn't considered scandalous, it was normal. A bed was a space to sleep, not a private sanctuary. The idea of everyone having their own little personal cocoon is a very modern concept. Bed placement. Where did these beds go? Usually in the corner of the single main room of a cottage, near the hearth. Heat was precious, so sleeping close to the fire made sense. In winter, families huddled as close as possible. In summer, you might move bedding to a loft space above the animals, where it was slightly less smoky and marginally more private. Yes, sometimes people literally slept above the barn animals. Warmth was warmth, and if that meant sharing your roof with a cow, so be it. The monastic bed. Now let's glide into monasteries. Monks had slightly better setups, but only just. Early on, they slept in large communal dormitories, rows of narrow beds, often little more than wooden planks with straw mattresses. Privacy was non-existent. Silence was required. Blankets were plain wool, usually rough and itchy, because monks weren't supposed to enjoy comfort. The rule of St. Benedict even specified that monks should all sleep in the same place, fully clothed, with lamps burning all night. Not exactly restful vibes. You were surrounded by 50 other men snoring, coughing, all expected to leap up at midnight for matins. A medieval sleepover, but without the fun. Noble beds, finally some comfort. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, we have noble beds. These were the iconic great beds you see in paintings. High wooden frames, thick feather mattresses, sometimes multiple feather beds stacked on top of each other for that cloud effect. Beds became status symbols. The richer you were, the taller and more decorated your bed. Some even had canopies, not just for looks, but to block drafts and provide a bit of privacy in large, cold halls. Curtains could be drawn around the bed, creating a warm little tent in the middle of an otherwise freezing castle chamber. Sheets were linen if you were wealthy, wool if you weren't. And covers included furs in winter, wolf, fox, or even ermine if you were fancy. And yes, servants were often tasked with warming the bed first, either by placing heated stones and pans under the blankets, or in some cases, by just lying in it until the Lord arrived. The ultimate unpaid internship. The Great Bed of Ware. Speaking of status beds, we can't skip the famous Great Bed of Ware. Built in the late 16th century in England, it was enormous, 10 feet wide, meant to impress. Travelers supposedly used it in an inn, and records say as many as 4 couples could sleep in it at once, which is either a logistical marvel or a nightmare, depending on how you feel about personal space. Though slightly post-medieval, it captures the vibe. Beds could be political statements, displays of wealth, or just conversation starters. In fact, offering someone a bed was one of the ultimate signs of hospitality. If you were traveling and a family gave you space in their bed, that was a big deal. It said, "We trust you enough to literally sleep next to us and hope you don't steal our spoons in the night." Very awkward, very medieval. Cleanliness, or the lack thereof. Now, let's address the elephant in the bed. Cleanliness. Straw mattresses attracted bugs. Fleas and lice were everywhere. Wealthy households employed servants specifically to beat and air out bedding to reduce infestations, but even kings had complaints about itchy nights. Some records even joke about noblemen scratching themselves during council meetings, not exactly the image of refined luxury. For peasants, infestations were simply a fact of life. You got used to it. Or you didn't, but either way, you didn't exactly have options. Bedtime clothing. What about pajamas? Well, no flannel sets with matching buttons. Most people just slept in their underclothes, or sometimes fully dressed if it was cold. Monks slept in their habits. Nobles might have linen nightshirts, but even those doubled as daywear at times. Children often went to bed naked or in shifts, and babies were swaddled tightly, which made sense in drafty, smoky cottages where warmth was more important than fashion. The sensory world of the bed. If you're picturing serene, clean beds, think again. Beds often smelled of smoke, damp straw, animals, and human sweat. Pillows, if you had them, were stuffed with feathers, wool, or straw and went flat quickly. Blankets were scratchy, and beds were often cold except where bodies pressed together. So while the noble four-poster bed looks romantic in a museum, the reality was usually less charming. You slept because you were tired, not because the bed was comfortable. Symbolism of the bed. That said, beds were more than just furniture. They were symbolic. Births happened in beds. Deaths happened in beds. Oaths were sworn on them. In noble households, the bedchamber was the ultimate private space, and being invited into it meant intimacy and trust. The bed was literally the center of life events, marriage consummations, childbirth, even political intrigue. It was where personal life and public duty overlapped. Beds in literature. Medieval literature loved to talk about beds too. Knights resting in them, ladies reclining in them, tricksters hiding under them. Beds showed up in romances, poems, sermons. They were shorthand for comfort, intimacy, or sometimes moral weakness. If a story wanted to show someone was lazy or sinful, guess what? They lingered in bed too long. So when you picture medieval beds, you've got two extremes. On one end, peasants scratching in straw, huddled together for warmth, dogs at their feet, smoke in their noses. On the other, nobles sinking into feathers, surrounded by curtains and warmed by furs, while servants stood nearby in case they sneezed. Both extremes shared one truth, though. The bed was never just yours. It was shared with family, strangers, attendants, or symbolic weight. The solitary, private bed with blackout curtains and memory foam is a modern invention. So let's settle into this picture. A smoky cottage at night, straw mattress lumpy but soft enough, a whole family curled together under a rough blanket, the baby swaddled tight, the fire dying low. Outside, the wind in the thatch. Or, in a castle, a canopy bed draped in velvet, warmed with furs, a lord half asleep while servants tidy the room. Same world, same night, two very different kinds of sleep. And as you imagine these beds, think of how much meaning was packed into them. Survival, family, rank, hospitality, even politics, all played out under blankets of wool and straw. All right, that's our gentle glide through medieval beds. Next time, we'll drift into dream interpretation, how people made sense of what happened after they fell asleep, and why your weird dream about cheese and demons could land you a visit from the local priest.
Hey guys, welcome back. We've covered peasants scratching in straw, monks mumbling in their habits, and nobles snoring under velvet canopies. But what happened after everyone finally drifted off? That's right, dreams. Because medieval people didn't just shrug off their dreams as random brain static the way we sometimes do. Dreams mattered. They were omens, messages, warnings, or temptations. Your average medieval person might not own a pair of shoes that fit, but they could definitely explain why last night's dream about a talking goat meant something about your soul. So tonight, let's sink gently into the world of medieval dream interpretation. Expect a little philosophy, a little theology, and a lot of very weird symbolism. Why dreams mattered. First, why did people care so much? Because in a world with limited scientific explanation, dreams were one of the only ways to access hidden knowledge. You couldn't Google symptoms, you couldn't check the weather forecast, and you certainly couldn't ask your therapist. But you could pay attention to what your subconscious cooked up at night. And remember, people believed dreams came from outside forces. Either God was sending you messages, or the devil was messing with you, or maybe your dinner was haunting you. That meant every dream, no matter how bizarre, was potentially meaningful. Ancient roots of dream theory. Medieval Europe didn't invent dream analysis. They inherited it from classical writers. Aristotle, Cicero, and especially Macrobius, the late Roman thinker, were big influences. Macrobius divided dreams into categories: prophetic dreams, which foretold the future; oracle dreams, which gave advice; allegorical dreams, where symbolism had to be decoded; nightmares, often attributed to bad health or demons; and nonsense dreams, caused by indigestion or chaos. Medieval scholars loved this system. They copied it into encyclopedias, taught it in monasteries, and then layered Christian theology over it. Because of course they did. Why not double down on confusing symbolism with extra guilt? Christian views of dreams.
The church had a complicated relationship with dreams. On one hand, the Bible is full of prophetic dreams, Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's famine dreams, or Daniel decoding Nebuchadnezzar's nightmares. That made dreams seem pretty important. On the other hand, dreams could be dangerous. Augustine warned that many dreams came from demons, tempting the sleeper into sin. If you dreamed of doing something immoral, was that your fault? Medieval theologians debated this endlessly. Some said, yes, your soul was guilty even if your body was asleep, which feels a little harsh, honestly. Imagine being held accountable for whatever nonsense your brain conjures at 3 a.m. Everyday dream beliefs. Outside of monasteries, everyday people had their own dream lore. Collections called dream books circulated widely. These listed common dream images and their meanings. For example, dreaming of teeth falling out, someone close to you will die. Dreaming of flying, good luck is coming. Dreaming of cats, treachery nearby. Dreaming of bread, prosperity, or possibly indigestion, depending on how stale it was. Some of these interpretations survive into modern superstition. Others feel like total guesswork, but they gave people a framework to make sense of the weirdness. Cheese, cabbage, and other culinary nightmares. Food also played a role. People believed certain foods caused bad dreams. Cheese, for example, was notorious. A heavy cheese supper supposedly led to wild, chaotic dreams. Beans and cabbage were also accused of fueling nightmares, which means a medieval peasant diet was basically one big invitation to demon-haunted sleep. Writers joked about this, too. If you dreamed of devils, maybe you just had too much goat cheese. It was the medieval equivalent of don't eat pizza before bed. Nightmares as demons. Nightmares weren't just bad dreams, they were often personified. The word nightmare itself originally referred to a supernatural creature, a mara or hag, who sat on your chest and suffocated you during sleep. This was basically medieval sleep paralysis explained with demons. If you woke up in the night unable to move, heart pounding, convinced something was pressing down on you, that was the nightmare. People blamed witches, demons, or restless spirits, which honestly sounds scarier than just admitting your nervous system glitched. Dreams in court and politics. Dreams even mattered in politics. Kings occasionally took dreams seriously when making decisions. Chroniclers sometimes inserted prophetic dreams into their histories to make events seem destined. If a king won a battle, someone would later claim he dreamed about victory the night before. Convenient. One famous example, before the Battle of Hastings in 1066, both Harold Godwinson and William the Conqueror were said to have had intense dreams, Harold of disaster, William of triumph. Were they real? Probably not, but they made great propaganda. Saints and holy dreams. On the positive side, saints often had holy dreams. Visions of the Virgin Mary, angels, or Christ appeared in sleep, offering comfort or instruction. These dreams carried enormous weight. Monks wrote them down, spread them as miracles, and sometimes even used them to found monasteries or justify pilgrimages. So, if your dream involved a glowing figure telling you to build a chapel, well, congratulations, you might just have started a new religious cult. Women's dreams. Dreams were also gendered. Women were thought to be more vulnerable to demonic dreams, partly because medieval men assumed women were weaker and more impressionable. Classic medieval sexism. Midwives and mothers sometimes interpreted children's dreams too, treating them as signs of health or illness. And, of course, a woman dreaming of romantic or sexual encounters was considered spiritually dangerous, whether or not she had any control over it, which meant guilty confessions over stuff you didn't even do. Dream manuals in practice. So, how would an average medieval person actually use dream interpretation? Let's say a farmer dreamed of losing his shoes. He'd check a dream book, maybe hear from a neighbor that it meant poverty was coming. He might then pray for protection or avoid risky trades that week. Dreams guided decisions, big and small. They were part of the cultural toolkit for navigating uncertainty. And in a world without modern science, they filled the gap between fear and explanation. Humor about dreams. Of course, not everyone took dreams seriously. Some writers poked fun. Chaucer's Book of the Duchess includes a character mocking dream interpretation as nonsense. Others joked that dreams just reflected whatever you were thinking about during the day. Still, even skeptics admitted that once in a while a dream felt eerie, timely, or meaningful, enough that you couldn't just ignore it. The slow drift. So picture a medieval night. You've settled into your straw or feather bed, the fire flickers low, you drift into first sleep, wake for prayers, then sink into second sleep. Dreams swirl, demons on your chest, angels at your side, cheese-induced monsters, prophetic victories. You wake at dawn, trying to decide, was it a message from God or just cabbage? Either way, you tell your family at breakfast and someone nods wisely and says, "Ah yes, that means you'll have guests today." And life goes on. A gentle wrap. So, medieval dreams weren't just private entertainment. They were spiritual, moral, sometimes terrifying, sometimes funny. They blurred the line between the body, the soul, and the world beyond. And while we might laugh at the idea of cabbage demons, let's be honest, we still look up dream meanings on the internet today. Maybe not much has changed after all. All right, that's part 9. Next time, we'll move into something even more down to earth, which is who people slept with, not in a scandalous way, but in the practical sense. Bed sharing, sleep partners, households all crammed together, because in the medieval world, your sleep space was never truly private.
Hey guys, welcome back. This is the last stop on our very long, very drowsy journey through medieval sleep. We've talked about segmented sleep, midnight prayers, straw mattresses, cheese nightmares, and roosters as alarm clocks. But before we close our eyes for good, we need to look at one final thing: who people actually slept with. And no, not in the spicy sense, though that certainly happened too, but in the far more mundane, practical sense of bed sharing. Because in the medieval world, you almost never slept alone. So let's curl up together, keep our elbows tucked in, and drift through the crowded world of medieval bed companions. Beds as communal spaces. First, let's remember, beds were expensive. Wood, straw, cloth, these things cost time and money. So you didn't waste them on individual beds for each person. Families, servants, and sometimes complete strangers piled into the same bed. Privacy wasn't the goal. Warmth and efficiency were. Your bed wasn't your personal sanctuary. It was part of the household's infrastructure, like the hearth or the water jug. Family bed sharing. Most peasant families all slept together. Parents, children, maybe even grandparents in the same bed, or at least the same room. Babies were swaddled and tucked in beside parents, often between mother and father. Older kids piled in too, or slept head to foot to make more room. It wasn't just peasants. Even in wealthier homes, children often slept in the parents' room, if not the same bed, partly for supervision, partly because heating multiple chambers was wasteful. The idea of a kid's bedroom decorated with dinosaurs or princesses would have been unimaginable. If you were lucky, you had a little trundle bed shoved under your parents' bed frame. More often, you just shared space with everyone else. Servants and households. Servants often shared their master's chamber. A nobleman might sleep in a fancy, curtained bed while his valet curled up on a pallet on the floor, or sometimes directly in the bed with him. Not in a romantic way, but because beds were functional, not sacred. Travelers, squires, and attendants also piled in. If you were high status, sleeping beside someone was a sign of trust. If you were lower status, it was simply your job. Either way, bed sharing reinforced the hierarchy. Inns and strangers. Then there were inns. Travelers didn't get private rooms. You paid for a bed, not a room. And that bed was probably already half full of strangers. So yes, you might walk into an inn, hand over your coin, and end up squeezed between two merchants you'd never met before, all of you snoring under the same scratchy blanket. If you complained, the innkeeper would probably laugh. That's just how it worked. Travel accounts mention this constantly. Some even describe the awkward shuffle of deciding which side of the bed you'd take, or dealing with someone who hogged the covers. Imagine medieval Yelp reviews. 2 stars, had to sleep next to a sweaty brewer from Bruges.
Political bed sharing also had a political role. Kings and nobles sometimes invited allies or ambassadors to share their bed as a show of closeness. It sounds weird to us, but back then it was the ultimate gesture of trust. Lying down beside someone meant you weren't armed, you weren't guarded, you were vulnerable. Sharing that vulnerability built bonds. So treaties, friendships, even royal visits might involve an awkward but very symbolic sleepover. Henry VIII, for example, was known to occasionally share beds with male courtiers, purely as a sign of favor. It didn't mean anything romantic, it meant, I trust you enough to let you drool on my pillow. The practical side of sharing. Beyond politics, there was the simple fact that sharing a bed made sense. Winters were freezing, fires went out, and extra body heat meant survival. Bed sharing kept people warmer and safer. It also meant extra noise, extra smells, and extra risk of lice. But you couldn't exactly be picky. Sleeping alone was not just lonely, it was impractical. Bed etiquette. So, was there etiquette? Yes. In families, you knew your place. Parents in the middle, kids on the outside. In inns, you might sleep fully clothed to keep things less awkward. People often lay head to foot to reduce accidental cuddling. And in political or courtly situations, you simply had to pretend it wasn't strange at all. Imagine rolling over in the middle of the night and bumping into the French ambassador. You'd both politely ignore it in the morning. Medieval diplomacy at its finest. Symbolism of shared sleep. So all of this meant that sharing sleep was symbolic as well as practical. It symbolized trust, loyalty, and community. Whether it was families huddling together, servants guarding their masters, or kings demonstrating intimacy with allies, the bed was a stage for relationships. Even marriages reflected this. The consummation of marriage was literally witnessed in bed by others, who sometimes even stayed in the room. Privacy was just not the priority. What mattered was the social bond created under the covers. Solitary sleepers. What about sleeping alone? It did happen, but usually only for very high-ranking individuals or for monks and nuns under specific rules. Even then, alone often meant alone in a curtained bed inside a dormitory of 50 other people. So if you had a bed all to yourself, it was either a sign of extreme privilege or of religious asceticism. For everyone else, solitude was rare. So let's picture it once more. A peasant cottage, smoky and dim, parents in the main bed, 2 children curled at their feet, a grandmother on a pallet by the fire. Outside, the animals shift in the byre. The air is thick, the room crowded, but the family shares warmth through the long winter night. Or an inn on a busy road. 6 strangers crammed into 2 beds, boots piled in the corner, snores competing with the creaking timbers. Someone coughs, someone dreams aloud, someone steals the blanket. And at dawn, they all get up, brush off the straw, and go their separate ways. Or in a castle, a lord behind heavy bed curtains, his squire dozing nearby, servants curled on pallets. The great hall echoes with quiet breathing, the cold kept at bay by fire and furs. Privacy is a luxury, but companionship is a constant. The final drift. So there we have it, medieval sleep in all its forms, segmented into 2 shifts, interrupted by bells, prayers, and midnight musings. Anchored in straw, feathers, or just bare floorboards, shaped by dreams of demons, angels, or maybe just cheese. And almost always shared because solitude was the rarest luxury of all. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't cozy by modern standards, but it was human. A daily rhythm woven through class, religion, family, and necessity. So the next time you complain about your lumpy mattress or your partner hogging the blankets, just remember things could be worse. You could be in a smoky cottage with 6 relatives, a cow under the loft, and a stranger from Bruges snoring in your ear. And with that thought, we'll close our eyes on medieval nights.
Thanks for drifting through this long, sleepy history with me. May your dreams tonight be prophetic, or at least not cabbage-related. Good night.